Welcome, everyone. Thank you on behalf of the UCLA Division of Population Behavioral Health, the DMH UCLA Prevention Center of Excellence, and the UCLA VA Veteran Family Wellness Center for attending today's Stress, Trauma, and Resilience seminar. My name is Tess Banco. I'm the Executive Director of the UCLA VA Veteran Family Wellness Center, and today we're fortunate to have Dr. Nathan Graeser with us. Nathan Graeser is both a social worker and an Army chaplain in the California National Guard. He's a national expert on policies and programs for supporting service members transitioning out of the military. A tireless advocate for veteran and military families, he has led multiple veteran initiatives in Los Angeles, including the Los Angeles Veterans Collaborative. As a licensed clinical social worker, he has also counseled hundreds on the intersection between transition, spirituality, and military culture, building better community policies for veterans who return home from war. Thank you for being with us today, Nathan.
Well, thank you for having me, Tess. What a wonderful beginning. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today as really we explore some really difficult issues that a lot of us were thrust into recently, but I get the feeling that probably anyone on this webinar is not new to the topics that we're going to discuss. So thank you. And we are going to have some chat functions here. So if anyone's on their phone, feel free to chime in, because probably most of us have been in Zooms for a while. And so I want to provide a little bit of interactivity. So the talk today really is about emerging from chaos. And you'll notice that I have a picture of a butterfly there. Because I really think that chaos is often presented to us in the form of what a chrysalis is, right? Where we're thrust into this new form, and then we have to think about how do we make sense of that experience and the chaos and the suffering. And so hopefully we're able to talk about some things that might get the juices flowing and thinking about how you can make sense out of a really stressful, chaotic time, even as the one we're living now. So I think it's probably important to start with just what are our current approaches to suffering. So if it wasn't obvious, we live in a world now that is pretty opposed to suffering on any level. It doesn't, and yet there seems to be a growing challenge with the number of people who really are actively experiencing suffering. So, they say mental illness now basically accounts for about a third of adult disability globally. And many think that probably in the next 3 or 4 years, it will really be sort of seen as, kind of a global challenge facing the world. And a lot of the way that we approach suffering if you go to doctors is that, doctors have a narrative of disease, suffering, and it's often different than the patient's story of the illness. And so there's often a sort of subtext to conversations where doctors are looking for the root of the suffering, or the root, not necessarily the root of the suffering, but looking to alleviate or get rid of the suffering. I hurt my ankle recently, and this was, really illustrated. And it was very quickly, they were like, well, can we just give you some painkillers and you go home? This is before COVID. I don't even know if I would have gone in now, but it gets this idea of the story of where suffering comes from, and the way that we've conceptualized a lot of our approach to suffering is to alleviate it. And even in mental health, we see this, that clinicians, even at the wellness center, one of the things we struggle is how do you alleviate suffering when there's kind of an unlimited supply of it today, right? We know suffering isn't just about physical or mental health, right? It also comes from all these other areas. And so, I think I really appreciated Niranjan's talk in one of the previous STAR seminar speakers, because he just basically said, we have a drastic shortage of clinicians on almost every level. And I think COVID really highlights this, right? We're really short on clinicians, both physically and in the mental health profession. And so the knowledge or the access to that kind of care. And so, it seems more and more obvious today that our approach is towards suffering, to professionalize it, to connect people to professional sources to alleviate it, really has to change if we're going to, if we want to help support people when they're living and real experiences of suffering. And then lastly, there's an interesting report that literally just came out last month from COVID-19. And it was, they interviewed over 1,300, almost 1,300 health workers. And, the numbers were staggering, right? Half of them had real symptoms of depression, 34% reported insomnia, 44% reported symptoms of anxiety. And, the majority of them, over 70%, had real stress. I have a good friend of mine who is a chaplain in one of the hospitals in New York, and she said, she spends a lot of time with the security guard, and she said, that a lot of these doctors and nurses, they really are feeling that this approach to alleviating suffering is really not working for them. They're really struggling. Which is interesting because I don't think it's not unique to COVID. Has basically just revealed our approaches towards suffering. So I wanted to give you a little about who I am, and I just start with this Albert Camus quote, which is, "Who taught you all this, doctor?" And the reply came promptly, "Suffering." I'm going to share some thoughts here with you, and I hope give you an opportunity to share with you about suffering. But I'm going to disclose here that a lot of what I'm sharing has come from my own suffering. And I imagine that many of your insights into suffering also have come from suffering. And I think thinking through what does it mean to suffer, or what does it mean to experience pain in a world that has a lot of pain, I think is really, is an important and often forgotten about art. As Tess mentioned, so I am a social worker and a chaplain, but I didn't choose those professions out of nowhere. I chose those because I kind of came face to face with suffering. I lost my best friend in Afghanistan in 2005, and I watched soldiers all around me suicide and fall apart. And I quickly realized that, man, I want to do something to this. And so I wanted to do something to address this. And so I think that's the case for many of us when we experience suffering, is that, it sort of forces us into a new world, or a world where we have to think about how to make sense of a life with suffering. And so I want to just begin with a question for all of you. It looks like we have a question. I just want to address it real quick. There's a question about whether this would be a COVID focus. No, this is not really about COVID. This is actually about a more global perspective on suffering. But I think COVID, because that's the world we live in, it has revealed some of our approaches as well. So let me just ask, with a question for all of you, where did you learn about suffering? And so I was thinking this is an opportunity to just put it in the chat box. Remember, if you click down, make sure you click all panelists and attendees so everyone can see it. Where did you learn about suffering? I imagine if you're joining us today, then you have some experience with suffering. So I see some said family life. I know for me, I feel like I learned a lot about suffering from working, not just in my own journey, but working with people who are suffering. I see on here, we also have people who said working with warriors. If you've been with people in really excruciating, painful experiences, then so we have some who said veteran. Yeah, for my veteran husband and father, childhood, even your work with clients, you learned about what suffering was. Some of us were born into situations that we just experienced a tremendous amount of suffering. I see a note from Howard on define suffering. Yeah, so we're going to get into that a little bit because I think it's an important idea of how do you define suffering. And I think our approach has changed a little bit. For now, let's just start with what you would consider suffering. Where did you learn about it? Because we're going to talk about some of the different definitions and even modern approach to suffering. And then I think that's how I want to think about how we rethink our ideas of suffering. Because I don't know that they're working for us. And, having sat with a lot of people who are suffering, I think that we don't have a lot of ways, that they don't seem to be helping in many ways. So the next question I have really is, what did you learn about suffering? For those of you who said, who answered, where did you learn it? What did you learn about suffering? Or what are you learning, perhaps? I know these are kind of deep questions, but I want you to think about what have you learned about suffering? I know for me, and part of the reason why I think this conversation is important is that when there has been unlimited, you're probably like me, you're getting invited to 100 different COVID, how to deal with loss and grief, and you're familiar with the Kubler-Ross, this idea of death and grief and dying. And so, but I think most of us haven't really thought about what do we actually know about suffering. Most of us have a pretty an understanding of suffering as this sort of negative part of life that we have to get through. I affectionately say most of the vets and the veterans that I work with, I think of suffering as something to white knuckle through. You just sort of grit your teeth and bear to maybe drink a little bit drink some water and take an ibuprofen and drive through it. So I think we have some really insightful comments in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing. Just as a reminder, you see that, just make sure you put all panelists and attendees so we can see it. So some of the insights here, reframing is important, not minimizing it. So acknowledging that you're actually suffering, how important that can be. I see some other comments here in to monitor and care for yourself when you're in the middle of suffering, to not ignore it. Even the idea that it's in suffering that you experience your own strength and resilience. We obviously have a tremendous amount of experience here with people who've really not only experienced but overcome and grown through experience of suffering. And it seems fitting that we are a resilience center, and this is the VFW, the Veteran Family Wellness Center, is housed within the Nathanson Family Resilience Center. And often I experience that when we talk about resilience, often we don't talk about the thing that we grow from, which is, we'll talk about this later, but where resilience comes from first, some sort of resistance. Usually that is some real experience of suffering. So I wanted to start with, how did we get to our current understanding of suffering? And I wanted to give kind of a brief ancient history, because suffering is not a new phenomenon. It's not a new experience. Almost, everyone who's lived has had an experience of suffering from the moment you're born. And one of the oldest ideas here is this idea of Erebos, which is, as you see, it's a dragon eating their tail. This is a famous alchemical from Carl Jung, a picture here. But the idea of Erebos was really that, if you think about it, that it was chaos that formed nature. Even it was chaos that formed the world. And that really, it was the introduction of chaos or new things that formed suffering. And that really, suffering is, it is sort of the symptom of newness. And Erebos was this idea that that out of the world birthed this new thing, and that the cycle, this is where we get this idea of yin and yang, or the infinity. You can see that there's even in the circle that they think that this is where we got our infinity sign, which is this old idea that where there's suffering is part of the cycle of newness and rebirth. And in that newness and rebirth is where suffering comes from. And the language for that, which we'll return to for suffering, actually was less about suffering and pain and more about this idea of pain and uncomfortableness in the rebuilding of life, or in the birth of life, and that there was pain and discomfort in that, in the existence of life, because that was the process. So the other idea of where suffering comes from, the old idea is that suffering is really the idea of the ancient Egyptians believed that suffering was actually represented in really two images. And so both tied to death, right? Because the ultimate, the idea that you basically suffer unto death. And so the two images that create suffering were one, which is the king cobra, the viper, which, even its bite, leads you to death. And then one who feeds off the remains of dead things. And so these were the ancient symbols that represented suffering and death. And as you can see, they really go hand in hand. I also, interestingly enough, if any of you know your Christian or Jewish, theology or stories, the story of Eden, one of the oldest foundations for some of the largest religions in the world is that the root, a lot of people, I grew up as a pretty conservative Christian, and the idea is the apple was sin, but it actually, remember, the apple is not this idea of sin. It's actually, I don't know if you remember, but it's the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, right? And so the idea of suffering is really that if you become aware that as you learned about things in the world is what actually created the suffering, and you can see how that then drives a response that the way that you protect yourself from suffering is to stay away or avoid evil, to be innocent of evil. You even see the old picture of the snake, right? To avoid evil or to avoid suffering is to avoid a knowledge of things, of certain things that will bring suffering, which is, in other words, it's the old picture of the monkeys, right? Don't understand or know some certain things in life, where you will suffer. The other idea was that suffering was really punishment. This is an old picture of Job, right? An old version of Job. It's this idea that suffering is really a punishment from God, or from the gods, right? And this is one of the oldest books that we have, even in a lot of the biblical texts, is this idea of punishment, that suffering was really a result of something you had done to anger or to disobey the gods. And so then the way you remedy that, so how you respond to that kind of suffering then, to that punishment, is that you don't go against the gods, right? Or a God. You don't, if God tells you to do something, you don't not listen, because then you will be punished and therefore you will suffer. And in order to mediate that suffering, to not have as much suffering in your life, then you have to avoid doing things that the gods don't want. And this isn't unique to Job, by the way. This is an old idea, right? This is a common idea that the way you avoid suffering is this way. The other way that is another ancient understanding of suffering is this idea of craving. And you find this in a lot of Buddhist and Hindu texts. But it's this idea that the root of suffering is craving, right? Because if you want something, then it will cause suffering. And not only if you want, but then if you get it, it will cause suffering because you can't get enough of it. And even if you get it, one day you won't get to have it, right? It'll go away like all things. And so the idea of craving as the root of suffering is this idea that the way you alleviate suffering is that you move yourself from desire, right? You literally move away from craving things to ultimately detachment, so that you can live in the world in a way that's not tied to the suffering. And so let's kind of talk about where that brings us at this point. At this point, you may be familiar with Castle in 1973. Sort of shaped this idea of suffering. He wrote a famous piece on re-understanding pain and suffering in patients, and defined really what I would say is mostly a modern definition of how we understand suffering, which is that suffering arises from perceptions of a threat to the integrity of a personhood. And it relates to the meaning patients ascribe to their illness experience, and it's intensely personal narrative. The other one that I and this sort of leads to this idea that it's a severely anguishing experience that we have to essentially help people out of. And I have a lot of thoughts on this, but maybe we can say that for the Q&A. Where we've gotten to at this place is, we've moved from a lot of different ways. You can see that how you understand suffering then shapes your response, right? Because if it's craving, then our ultimate desire is to do away with craving. If our ultimate desire, if suffering is about the burden, the existence, the chaos in the world, then the way that we alleviate suffering is to adapt to the chaos, or if it's God, then if it's knowledge, then we need to stay away from things that we shouldn't be knowing about. And so here, if we define suffering as something that is a threat and really is an experience of intense pain, then the way that we respond to that is by making people not experience that, right? Is to encourage people to move into places that they won't experience suffering. And I think you see this in the way that our medical approach, that often the way that we treat our bodies, and if you're a clinician, you've probably had the experience many times where a big part of, if you're a big clinic, any part of a clinician's work is to help people go into experiences that are potentially very painful, right? Where you have to have experiences of courage to go into dark or scary places in your life. And so having a definition of suffering with a general sense that what we want to do is take away suffering from everyone is that, I sort of say it's that we're encouraging this kind of white knuckle scenario where we're like, hey, anything you can do to not avoid suffering. And I think this is and so you see that play out in the society as well, right? With rampant opioid use, and we just see the symptoms of a world where we have given no real meaning or value to suffering. And that actually suffering in an end of itself, we say, look, there's, avoid suffering at all costs. And maybe there's going to be a little bit of pain, but man, all we're trying to do is get out of suffering. And you even see that in some of the COVID response that, we're having to have that conversation now that maybe we weren't used to having. But we're playing out the modern definition of suffering because now we have an example of this. And you see this even in some of the approach, right? So the World Health Organization's definition of health, right? This is who's been leading the pandemic. This is the World Health Organization. They say that health is really a complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence or disease of infirmity. Notice what's not in this, right? That, the aim of life on some level is to eradicate suffering. I mean, the next few sentences, if you look into this, is that, what we're asking people to do is to move into this sort of suffering-free existence, to have complete physical and mental and social well-being, so that you're at peace all the time. And then, Castle has this idea of intact, right, to threat to personhood that often accompany this idea, that we mentioned before, that that suffering is a threat. It is a threat, or the idea that it's dislocated. You see this now, that that it's really experimented, and even in some of the pain research, you see this. It's dislodged from a person. The suffering is not tied into the narrative and how a person interacts in the world, but it's something to be looked at and sort of dissected. And this is exactly what Foucault said, right? This is the physician must distance themselves. Same place where we get when you do clinical work. I notice that there's a difference when have my clinician hat on as opposed to maybe when I'm a chaplain, because sometimes there's not as much of a distance. Sometimes if I'm, especially if you're in a deployed environment, you don't get to have there's not a lot of distance. You really have to, there's many times where you have to self-disclose, and you have to, because it's obvious you're living with someone and there's not a lot of distance. You eat dinner with someone who you also might talk to for an hour later. So what do we do here? And I want to make sure that we have time for discussion and questions. So I want to offer some ideas, not just offer a bunch of problems for why we got here and how we think about suffering, because I really do think that that there is a path here to, and I think that what people really want is a pathway to make sense of their pain and suffering. I even see some of the comments here that when, one of the impetuses here is that when people aren't offered a narrative that suffering has a real role to play, and they experience a lot of suffering, like in war, like in my experience, then, essentially we've sent them off, and we've sent them into the wild blue yonder, and we haven't said that there's, they have to write their own way. And I think we can do better for people who are really suffering, or who have experienced some of the destructive parts. And I think one of the first parts of that is that I think it's really important to kind of neutralize suffering. And what I mean by that is, even if pain and suffering are unpleasant, I think everyone universally doesn't enjoy the experience of suffering, right? It's always unpleasant, right? You're uncomfortable in your skin, you have an experience, you literally feel dislocated. But I think decoupling that so that it's not it's not always destructive. It actually can either be destructive or constructive, and it can actually be a force that can either tear you down or build up the self. And I don't have a picture here, but I don't know if anyone ever played Mario Kart. The analogy I like to use here is that, you ever played Mario Kart? Those little arrows that you hit and it speeds you up? I often associate, like, when you're in experiences of suffering, what a wonderful analogy that what this does is it pushes you in a direction. And so you can move into your life in a more intense, engaged way, or you can move away from your life in a more intense, engaged way and disengaged way. And so it really kind of forces decisions. And I see that even in my soldiers coming home and even in my own life, that it forces you to make decisions about your own quality of life when you experience suffering. If you've really had traumatic loss, then you have that you've had that experience. And I included here, I love this quote, that a smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. That when we think of even about the idea of resilience, is that resilience comes from this idea that you have to be able to overcome or even experience suffering and then be able to move through it in a way and actually, even become a more engaged, more thoughtful person in the world. I have had the experience many times where soldiers come back from war and their wives will say, he's a better husband now. He's a better father. Wow, like it's totally different now. Man, that was hard. We have a much better marriage now after the third deployment because we've had to fight for stuff that we never had to fight for. We had to, the equivalent of sort of digging up your garden over and over again. You have to keep digging up your garden. And so you learn what's in there and you do work that maybe you wouldn't have had to do had you not experienced the kind of suffering that comes from it. And so I think it's probably a helpful phrase to just sort of to neutralize it. So it's not about suffering isn't, when we say we want to alleviate all the suffering, it's like, well, actually suffering is, suffering is an existent force in the world. And maybe what if we could move from, thinking that it's all bad and actually allowing people to be there long enough to see if they can emerge from it. So here's some thoughts, and then I would love to get into some Q&A. I know we have some questions, and so the idea is just like the Yorobos, that suffering is actually can actually be thought of as the precursor or the soil of new life. And that's painful to think about, but actually, most of us have experiences that has, I imagine if you're here, even on this webinar, that you've had experiences with suffering that have forged new life in you. And I have here the Yorobos, right? Eating this idea of it's in the suffering that new life comes, and so that the dragon is eating its tail because it's rethinking how it's its own self to it's using its own experience and its own things that has grown to feed itself to become a new to sustain life. And if you think about this, even the image of birth, right? The old image of birth is that it's surrounded in suffering, but no one, like obviously it's uncomfortable, and pain, the pain associated with childbirth is, obviously extremely shocking. But it surrounds new life, and so what if we could think of emerging from chaos? Is that that suffering is surrounds new when we bring new life in the world. Suffering is the enclosure that it often takes. And so that brings a couple thoughts to mind, which is that when you're surrounded by an experience of chaos, that actually there's actually something else. Obviously we're very aware and we're reminded constantly that there are bad things, or that the news, whatever it is reminding us that how painful and horrible it is to be suffering and to be in a world of chaos. a few months ago, we were all initiated into this world of chaos, right? But a question I have in this is, what has emerged in you in chaos? Chances are you got here because things emerged in you in past experiences of chaos. And so here are some questions that I would ask you, and you could even use this in your practices, which is, when you're in the middle of experiences of chaos, one often forgot about, but really interesting thing to do is that, if you think about this as anytime you're in an experience of suffering, it can also be the ancient idea of the robos, the rebirth, right? That it's an opportunity to rebirth. And I think this echoes veterans' experience when they come home, and that they have to rebirth themselves, right? They have to be reborn. And, if you know anything about I love the image of a caterpillar because, it goes into a cocoon, and most people think it just kind of grows wings and comes out. But actually it doesn't. What it does is it goes into the cocoon and then liquefies. And then it has to it examines all of what it has and then says, hey, we have everything we need to make a butterfly, right? And so then it goes into liquid and then reforms everything. It's all new. And so the question I have here is, what behaviors have emerged for you in the middle of this chaos? Or if you're experiencing a lot of suffering in your life right now, what new behaviors have emerged for you? Maybe this is someone in your family, and feel free you can put this in the chat box if you want. What new behaviors have emerged? So maybe there's a new friendship. Maybe there are, there is a return. I've talked to a lot of people who, say that the work they thought they had done has sort of come right back up in the middle of all this, right? That suddenly they didn't have whatever they were doing to keep them from, to hide or distract them from some of the wounds in their life. So what insights, what insights have you had during this COVID? Are there parts of your life that perhaps you don't want to go back to? One question I've been asking a lot of myself is, even during this chaos, is, was your life really so good? Was my life really so wonderful and balanced and peaceful before COVID? And anytime something new emerges, I when I would do marriage counseling one time, I'd often say is, when you say yes to something, you also have to think about, learning your no muscle as well. So learning how to say no to things is also a way to say yes to things. And as things emerge, it also means that other parts of you may have to be left behind. So what in you do you realize, hey, this has to change now? And that a big part of emerging more adapted out of chaos is to acknowledge that there are parts of you that you'll need to keep and grow like a new wing, and there are other parts of you that have to stay behind. And anytime we get initiated into an experience of suffering, that is the case. That's hard. And I think one of the best. I see Tom had a wonderful, isolation has a spotlight on the importance of relationships. Most of us experience that the way that we emerge from chaos is, the old story is that there's this collective sense. Even the Greeks had this idea of polis, that the way that you made sense of the chaos was that you had to sort of put all your pieces together, right? That it was that your identity and who you were emerging was caught up not just in your own, but it was in the collective, and so that other people can help. And one thing I might ask is what if those are hard questions for you? Maybe ask people in your life, hey, what what am I doing now that is working or not working for you that I didn't do before? Like, well, you seem so much more, you're less stressed now. I love this when I love this. And that is, I think I've shared with some of my colleagues that this has felt very similar to coming home from a deployment in 2018, because your world gets sort of thrown into just last year I was coming home, I just come home and I remember thinking, man, it's so disorienting, and how much of this is disorienting, right? It's literally chaos. And so, there are obviously people have written a lot about thinking about how do you conceptualize suffering and pain. But I guess I wanted to open it up to some questions, and maybe a discussion if there are some thoughts here. About this idea. Is this new to people? Are you, I see some people in the chats and, my past experiences have prepared you really. I think that's a wonderful take on life, right? To be able to sort of look back at the past and some of the pain of the past and see. So one of the questions here that I see here is, since I experienced a lot of suffering throughout my life, I had this idea that I was here and meant to suffer. But after going through a traditional Lakota healing lodge, this really challenged my relationship with suffering. How do you hold both the idea that although we may experience suffering, we are not here to suffer? Yeah, that's great. So one of the challenges with neutralizing the idea of suffering, so saying that it can both be destructive and constructive, is that if you've lived in America and you've had real experiences of suffering, someone has said something horrible to you when you're suffering. Like, this is a universal experience. Most of us, if you ever lost someone in your life, people will say all sorts of things. And most of them revolve around, hey, they usually start with comments like, at least you had a husband, at least you had a best friend. A lot of them start with some sort of forced meaning making. Like, I remember when Brett died, people would say stuff like, God just needed another football player in heaven. It's people's way of making sense of suffering. And so the way that we do that, the danger with saying that suffering could be constructive, or can have some constructive force in your life, is that then we take it one step and say, oh, like, this is just part of, isn't it great you're going through suffering? And I think that suggests a very simple or very simple understanding. I think it's a much more helpful inference to say that suffering isn't good or bad, and that we can have experiences of suffering that we still haven't figured out how to make into constructive experiences in our life. And I think that's true for a lot of the suffering, if you're really honest in your life, that there are not experiences that you naturally, even the idea that you just sort of step through the stages of grief and that's not how most people experience suffering and grief. Most people experience them as a sort of ongoing process. That it's sort of this ongoing, it's sort of like, if you think about it as the kind of soil metaphor, if you think about what soil is made of things that were once alive. It's the trees and the plants that were once alive that now provide the nutrients, and they're constantly breaking down. And I think, many of us, if you've had a lot of experiences of suffering, then you have a lot of a lot of soil to break down, to figure out how to make sense of, how to translate into an experience that could be constructive in the world and would urgently connect you to a world that's more meaningful. There's another question on here I want to respond to that says, what are some applicable best practices to start the conversation with clients, patients, and folks? I think a lot of the work in clinical work really depends. My theory in working with clients or in any relationship is really a lot of it is unresolved grief. My experience is this, and or places in your life where you weren't able to accept or didn't have the capacity to deal with some of the suffering you were presented with. And so rather than offering kind of one-time solutions or like, here's 3 questions, I think a big part of it is to start to do the work, to start here. I'm pointing to myself, so that you're able to walk with people in the journey. And I'd say in the last 2 or 3 years, I've really adopted much more of an attitude of walking with people in their journey than sort of providing them and helping them ask questions that will help them be more engaged in the world. And for me, that has really been some of the, I have an opportunity on occasion to do, as a chaplain in the Guard, I do death notifications, which is one of really the most sacred and difficult works you can do, which is, you're with someone on probably the worst day of their life. And when there's something about going into someone's living room and asking to sit down and then you're with them. Universally, I've just noticed they all say the same thing after the initial shock and the screaming, whatever it is. They almost all say the same thing, which is like, what do I do now? Like, where do I go? What should I do? And I often think that it's disorienting, right? It's a disorienting, and isn't that how life is, right? That so much of life is, we're thrown into experiences of chaos that disorient us. And so a big part of how I think we can walk with people is to support people, is to walk with them, is to say, you're going to do it one day at a time, and you're not going to do it alone. And I think that's a big part of what this looks like. I see a question here. When do you think is the best time to initiate a conversation with a client around suffering? While they're in it, or in the reflection past suffering, or even anticipating suffering? How might the timing affect the conversation? Timing is everything. A well-choiced, phrase at the right time is obviously ideal. But I think to some degree, most people aren't, it's very difficult to initiate the conversation around how do you come up with a theory about how do you suffer? How do you suffer in a world? How do you make sense of suffering in the world? And in an honest way, how do you support someone who's actively experiencing suffering without belittling it? How do you do that? I think there are probably a couple ways to do that. I think one is, I really believe that there's some power in the Socratic method, that people will naturally accept and hear what they're ready to hear. And so allowing, asking questions and providing an environment where people can have access to some of that, but you're not forcing it on someone. If you've ever been in an experience, it can be very bullying to be sort of thrust into a situation that you're not ready for. And I really, I think, just Gestalt really talks about this, right? The idea that people will allow in, and they're, if you allow them to, they will receive as much as they can receive. And so that would be where I would start. I see another one, which is our culture phobic to suffering? How do we cooperate with phobia on a daily basis? How are we to be when with the sufferer? That's a great question. I think it's pretty clear that our culture doesn't have that this is part of what I was talking about with suffering, is that, if suffering is bad and we're trying to cure all suffering in the world, then it naturally encourages people to run from it or to disengage. And so how challenging, and of course, then people are afraid to talk about it too. It's also, there's a heavy stigma around suffering. I know in the military culture and a lot of law enforcement, if you say you're suffering, it's that white knuckle approach, right? There's not a meaning to draw from it. This was the ancient shamans, the ancient, the old rule of the spiritual guides was to move into the suffering, and that if someone stated that there was something, they would say, hey, something is potentially birthing in you, right? And so we need to, it's one of the things I think we're missing in a lot of the transition rituals, is that we don't have a way to birth new things when someone's experiencing the excruciation and the pain of being thrown into a chaotic world post-war. I have personally experienced this. I jokingly say there may be no worse place to suffer than in America today, because there isn't a lot of space to suffer. People will run from you pretty fast. And so I wanted to, something came up. There is one other question here that as you say this, that how do you walk with a sufferer? How do you connect with someone who is suffering in a way that has meaning, without belittling and saying like, hey, you're suffering, you're suffering for a good reason. Because I think that can be as damaging, especially when those reasons aren't known. And I think it's also interesting that we have to have a reason for suffering. I'm going to go a throwback, one of the oldest books that we have still written, right? Job, this whole treatise on a man who basically loses everything ends with this, all these questions, he asks all these questions about why he's suffering, and it ends with no answers, but really like, why does suffering have to, like, why are you asking why? Why is, who are you to say that suffering is not part of this existence? And it's this whole thing, it's a wild, like, poem. Sigmund Freud once said, I think do I have this quote in one of these slides? Maybe I took it out. I did. That the quote was, he said, everywhere I ever go, a poet has been there before me. That really speaks to this idea that things can be birthed in suffering, right? That as you dig into the suffering, this is one of our foremost psychologists, as you sink into this and the experience of humans and how they make sense of suffering, a poet has been there before, right? Somebody wrote a song about it already. The black dirt is what they call it, right? That's the best thing that for plants is that black dirt, the active experiences of suffering. And it doesn't make it good. And I think it's dangerous to say, oops, I keep doing that. I think it's dangerous to say that it has to have meaning, because I don't know that to experience suffering means that you have to have meaning. But I do think that when you experience it, it does create the conditions to either be constructive or destructive. And so then I think that's a way that you can support people, and even clients and people you work with, that in that is the way that you support people, is that allow people to make a decision. I just want to thank you for joining me in this conversation and us. Your thoughts are so wonderful, and I wish I could get to them all. We have some really intriguing thoughts here. Thank you for your commitment to people and to share. I have one last question, I guess, which is, do we need more bards to help sufferers? Bard is the Shakespearean concept, the bard, to be storytellers. I personally have experienced that the language of suffering is often story and images. And so, it's one of the reasons why people tie themselves into movies and poems, and why they get creative is because we need storytellers and guides. This is why my children, it's hard to grow up in the world, especially hard to grow up probably now. It's why every second of their life, like, tell me a story, tell me a story, tell me a story. It's innate, right? We want to know stories to help us make sense of our life. And, when you're in a chaotic environment, you realize that you need more information and you want to make sense of it. And so, yeah, I think, practice your storytelling. You need a lot of you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Graeser, for a wonderful, thought-provoking presentation, and thank you for all who came together to make it possible. Also, thank you all for your time in attending today's STAR seminar. Please, especially during this time, be gentle with yourselves and others. I'm wishing you and your families continued wellness.